In the autumn of 1879, on a wind-scoured siding outside the freight town of Collie Bend in the Dakota Territory, a girl of 19 stood beside a thing the whole town had agreed was worthless. She had a single coin in her fist, and the cold had already begun to climb up through the soles of her boots. The wagon before her had belonged to a dead man, a gambler named Asa Pelham, who had died owing money to half the county, and it had sat at the edge of the lot for 2 winters with its canvas gone to rags and its wheels sunk to the hubs in frozen mud. The auctioneer had laughed when she raised her hand. He had taken her dollar and he had called it charity, and he had told the men around him that the girl had bought herself a grave on wheels. What none of them knew, and what she did not yet fully know herself, was that the man who built that wagon had built it to keep a secret, and that the boards beneath its bed were not what they appeared to be. Her name was Della Mott, and 4 days before that auction she had been put out of the only home she had ever known. Stay with this one. By the end, you will see what was hidden under a dead man's floor for 2 long years, and what one girl with a borrowed skill did with it. First, though, you have to understand how a girl came to own a wagon for the price of a loaf of bread, and why her hands, of all the hands in that town, were the ones that could open it. Della had been raised in the back rooms of a wheelwright shop. Her father had died when she was small, and her mother had taken work cooking for a man named Harlan Speck, who owned the largest freight concern between the river and the hills. For 11 years, Della and her mother lived in 2 rooms behind Speck's stable yard, and Della grew up among axles and felloes and the smell of hot iron, because the wheelwright who worked for Speck was an old man named Tobias Reed, and Tobias had no children and a great deal of patience. He taught her the way a man teaches when he believes a thing is worth teaching. He showed her how a wheel is dished so it will carry weight without folding, how the grain of oak must run with the strain and never against it, how a joint that is cut true will outlast the man who cut it. He let her hold the spokeshave when her hands were still too small to close around it, and he did not laugh when she ruined a length of good hickory learning the feel of the blade. He told her that wood remembers everything done to it, that a board will tell you who built it and how, and that a careful hand can read a thing the way a preacher reads scripture. Tobias died in the spring before Della turned 18. He left her his tools, a chest of them, planes and chisels and a spokeshave, worn bright at the handle from 40 years of his grip. He left her nothing else because he had nothing else, and the tools were the only inheritance she had ever expected to receive. Her mother died that winter of a fever that took half the yard with it. And Harlan Speck, who had tolerated the cook's daughter so long as the cook was alive to work, looked at Della across the cold months that followed and decided she was a mouth he did not care to feed. He did not put her out unkindly. That was the part she would remember longest, how reasonable he made it sound. He called her into the front room of the house where she had rarely been allowed, and he sat behind his desk with his hands folded on the blotter, and he spoke to her the way a man speaks when he has already decided a thing and wishes to be thought fair about it. He told her she was 19 and able-bodied, and that the rooms behind the stable were needed for a man with a family. A teamster he was bringing on for the spring hauling, who had a wife and would do the work of 2. He said it as though the rooms had asked for the change themselves. He told her the world was hard and that he had carried her and her mother longer than most men would have, which was not true, for her mother had worked every day, she lived under his roof, and Della had mended his wheels for nothing since she was 14. He gave her until the end of the week. He gave her $1, folded once, pressed into her palm at the door as though it settled something, and he told her that a girl with sense would find a situation in town before the snow came hard. She did not weep in front of him. She had learned from Tobias that you do not show a thing your hand before you are ready to use it. She took the $1 and her chest of tools, and she walked out into the yard, and the men loading freight did not look at her, and the gate closed behind her with the particular finality of a door that will not open again. For 3 days she slept in the loft of a livery that the owner let her use in exchange for mending a cracked wheelfellow. Work she did in an afternoon with Tobias's tools, while the man watched and said nothing, and then looked at her differently afterward. He could not take her on. He had 2 sons already idle. He did tell her, though, about the auction, the clearing of old Pelham's debts, and he told her there was nothing there worth $1, and that was how she came to be standing at the siding on the 4th day with her whole fortune in her fist. The wagon was a Murphy freighter, or had been once, the heavy kind built to haul ore and lumber over the worst roads the territory had. It was longer than a man and a half lying end to end, and its bed sat high on iron-tired wheels that came near to Della's shoulder. The canvas top had rotted to gray strings. The seat was split and warped. Mice had been in the toolbox and birds in the bows. Everything about it said that it had been left to die, and the men who walked past it at the auction said so too, plainly the way men say a thing they have never once doubted. Della, though, had not been looking at the canvas or the seat. She had been looking at the bed. A Murphy wagon's bed is built of planks laid edge to edge over cross beams, and the planks are plain, and they are nailed, and there is nothing to them. The bed of this wagon was not plain. The planks had been fitted, not nailed, joined at their edges with a tongue and groove, so fine she had to crouch and run her thumb along the seam to be sure she saw it. No freighter needed a floor cut like a parlor table. No teamster hauling ore would have spent the days it took to fit a wagon bed the way a cabinet maker fits a drawer. Someone had built this floor to be lifted and set down again without a mark, and someone had gone to great trouble to make it look like a thing no one would ever lift. That was what she paid her $1 for, not the wagon, the question. The auction itself had taken less than a morning. Pruitt the auctioneer had worked through Asa Pelham's goods in the order a man clears a dead stranger's life, the small things first and the large things last, a chipped wash basin and a deck of greasy cards and a pair of boots with the soles worn through, and then the harness, and then the wagon, which he saved for the end because it was the only thing left that anyone might have wanted and because he already suspected no one did. When he came to it, he did not bother to climb up on the wheel and call its virtues the way an auctioneer does for a sound rig. He stood at the front of it with his thumbs in his vest, and he told the dozen men gathered in the cold that here was the last of the Pelham estate, a Murphy freighter, and that he would take any honest offer, and the men laughed before he had finished the sentence because they had all walked past that wagon for 2 winters and they all knew what it was. One of them called out that he would give $1 to have it hauled off his sight line. Another said the canvas alone was worth more as rags, and a third said the rags were not worth the carrying. Pruitt let them have their joke. Then a girl at the back of the lot, in a coat too thin for the season with a wheelwright's tool chest at her feet, raised her hand and said the word $dollar in a voice that did not waver, and the laughter stopped for a moment and then started again, louder, because now it had something to fasten on. Pruitt looked at her over the heads of the men. He asked her, not unkindly, whether she understood that the thing did not roll and could not be moved and held nothing but mice. She said she understood it. He shrugged, and he took her coin, and he wrote her a receipt in his own hand on a scrap torn from his book, the make of the wagon and the date and the sum of $1, and he handed it down to her with the particular smile a man gives a child who has insisted on a bad trade. He told her she now owned a grave on wheels, and that the digging was extra, and the men around him thought that a fine thing to have said. Pruitt found the whole business so amusing that he told it twice that evening in the saloon, how the Mott girl had bought a dead man's ruin, and how she would learn what a fool learns. There was a man at the bar who did not laugh. His name was Coyle, and he had been Asa Pelham's creditor, the largest of them, a man who lent money at the freight office and held paper on half the wagons in the county. He had expected the auction to clear Pelham's debt and leave a tidy remainder. Instead, the estate had brought almost nothing, and a wagon he had marked in his ledger as security against $40 of Pelham's note had gone to a girl for a coin. Coyle did not laugh, because Coyle was doing arithmetic, and the arithmetic was coming out wrong, and a man in his trade does not like sums that will not close. Della did not know any of that yet. She knew only that night had come, and she had a wagon and nowhere to take it. So she slept in its rotted bed under her own coat, with the cold coming up through the fitted planks, and in the morning she began to work. She had no team to move it, and nowhere to move it to, so she worked where it stood, at the edge of the lot in the open, where anyone could see. That was deliberate. Tobias had taught her that a thing done in the open is a thing no one can later call theft, and she had a creditor's town all around her and $1's worth of claims she meant to keep. She started with a toolbox under the seat because that was where a wagon kept its truth. Most of it was ruined, but at the bottom, wrapped in oilcloth gone stiff as bark, she found a single tool that did not belong to any teamster. It was a thin pry bar, flat and tapered, the kind a cabinet maker uses to lift a glued panel without scarring the face. Asa Pelham had kept a cabinet maker's tool in a freighter's toolbox. She held it a long moment. Then she understood that the man who built the floor and the man who drove the wagon were the same man, and that he had kept the key to his own secret an arm's length from the lock. Have you ever held a thing in your hands and felt the whole shape of a story you could not yet see? She felt it then. She set the bar down, and she did not use it yet because she did not yet know what she would find. And a careful hand learns the lock before it forces the door. For 2 days she did nothing but read the wagon. She measured the bed inside and out, and the numbers did not agree. The bed was 11 inches deep from the top of the side rails to the floor she could see, but the wheels and the axles and the bolster sat the wagon higher than that off the ground, and when she crawled beneath it and measured from the underside of the crossbeams up to the floor, she could touch the figures left her 4 inches. She could not account for 4 inches of nothing, running the whole length and width of a freight wagon's bed. She lay in the frozen mud under that wagon, and she understood that the floor she could see was not the floor that carried the load. A false bottom. The phrase came to her plainly. The way Tobias had taught her to name a thing once she was sure of it no sooner. The wagon had a false bottom, 4 inches deep, and the size of a freighter's bed, and a tool to open it, and a dead man who had built it both, and the whole town had walked past it for 2 winters calling it a ruin. On the 3rd day the weather turned, and the first hard snow came, and a man came with it. He came on a good horse with a clerk's coat and a ledger book under his arm, and he stood at the edge of the lot and watched her work for a while before he spoke. He introduced himself as a representative of Coyle's interest, and he told her, courteously, that the wagon she was sitting in had stood as security against a debt of the late Mr. Pelham, and that there was some question whether it had been the auctioneer's to sell. He suggested that the simplest course would be for her to surrender the wagon to Mr. Coyle, who would, of course, reimburse her $1, and the matter would trouble her no further. Della listened to all of it. Then she asked him one question. She asked whether Mr. Coyle's paper named this wagon by its make and number, or whether it named only a wagon, in general, among Pelham's goods. The clerk did not answer at once, and the not answering was an answer. She told him that she had bought the wagon at a public auction, in the open, before witnesses, and that she had a receipt with Pruitt's own hand on it, and that if Mr. End, Coyle believed he had a better claim, he was welcome to bring it before the territorial court at the county seat, 60 miles east, in the spring, when the roads opened. She said it without heat. She had learned that the plainest voice carries the furthest. The clerk closed his ledger and rode back into the snow, and Della understood 2 things. The first was that whatever lay under the floor was worth more than $1, to Coyle far more, or he would not have sent a man on a good horse through the first snow to talk her out of it. The second was that she now had very little time. Coyle would not wait for the spring court. A man who lent money for a living had quieter ways of settling a sum than a courthouse. So that night, by the light of a lantern she had traded a day's wheel mending for, with the snow ticking against the rotted canvas overhead, Delamotte took up the cabinet-maker's pry bar and began to open the dead gambler's floor. She did not force it. She found the seam first, the fine tongue and groove join she had felt the first day, and she followed it with her thumb, until she found the one plank whose grain ran crosswise to the rest, a plank no wider than her two hands, set near the front of the bed where a driver's heel would never wear it. She worked the tapered bar into the seam the way Tobias had shown her, to lift a glued panel, a little at a time, listening to the wood, because wood will tell you when it is about to splinter and when it is about to give. The first attempt taught her the floor was cleverer than she had guessed. The plank did not lift when she leaned her weight on the bar, and a less patient hand would have driven the bar deeper and cracked the face and ruined in a moment what had taken a man weeks to build. She stopped. She set the lantern closer, and she studied the crosswise plank along its whole length, and she saw that it had been waxed where the others were oiled so that it would slide rather than pry, and she understood that Pelham had not built a lid to be levered but a panel to be drawn. She turned the bar and used it flat, as a wedge, to start the slide, and she pushed with the heel of her hand along the grain, and the plank moved a quarter inch with a small, dry sound, like a held breath let go. It gave then. The short plank slid clean, and beneath it was a finger hole cut into the next, and a wooden turn button, and the whole front section of the false floor swung up on a leather hinge gone hard as horn. Cold air came up out of the space beneath, air that had been sealed under that floor since before Asa Pelham died. It smelled of oiled cloth and old paper and the particular dryness of a place the weather has never reached. She held the lantern over the opening, and she looked down into 4 inches of darkness running the length of the wagon, and at first she thought it was empty, and her heart went down into her cold boots. Then the light found the edges of things laid flat, oilcloth bundles fitted side by side as carefully as the planks above them, dozens of them. The whole bed of the wagon paved with them, and she understood that the false bottom was not empty at all. It was full. She lifted the first bundle out with both hands. It was heavier than it looked. She unwrapped the stiff oilcloth on the wagon seat with the lantern close, and inside was not money, though she had half expected money. Inside were papers, deeds, a sheaf of land deeds, each one folded and docketed in a clerk's careful hand, and beneath them, banded together, a stack of promissory notes. And beneath those, ledger pages torn from a bound book, and a thick packet of letters tied with waxed thread. Delamotte had been taught to read by her mother, and to read wood by Tobias Reed, and now she sat in a freezing wagon and taught herself line by line to read the thing a dead man had built a wagon to hide. The deeds were the key, and they were terrible in their plainness. They were deeds to homestead claims, 11 of them, in the valley west of Collie Bend, the bottom land along the creek where the soil was deep and the water never failed. Each deed had been signed over, the original homesteader's name struck through, and Coyle's name entered in its place. And each transfer was dated within a span of 2 years, and each was witnessed by the same hand and notarized by the same seal. 11 families had signed away the best land in the county, and on paper it was all lawful, every transfer in order, every signature in its place. Della read them by lantern with her breath clouding over the pages, and she laid them out across the wagon seat in the order of their dates, and she saw that the strike-throughs had all been made with the same brown ink and the same narrow nib, as though one hand had crossed out 11 lives in a single sitting. Asa Pelham, though, had not hidden lawful paper under a false floor. The ledger pages told the rest, and the letters told it plainer still. Asa Pelham had been Coyle's man before he was Coyle's debtor. He had carried the money out to the homesteaders in the hard winters, the small loans against the next harvest that a struggling family takes when the alternative is starving, and he had carried back the signatures. And somewhere in those 2 years, Pelham had begun to keep a second record, the true one, the one that showed what the deeds did not. It showed that the loans had been written at one figure and recorded at another. A man lent $60 and charged against $100, the difference vanishing into the space between two sets of books. It showed that the foreclosures had been called months before the notes were truly due, the dates altered in Coyle's own books, a note signed for the autumn called in the spring while the family still believed it had a season to pay. It showed that the homesteaders had been told their claims were lost when they were not yet lost, frightened into signing by a man who held a paper they could not read against a calendar they could not check. Della set the false ledger beside the true one and ran her finger down the two columns together, the recorded sum and the real sum, line after line, and the gap between them was the size of a valley. 11 families had been turned off the best land in the county by arithmetic. The same quiet arithmetic that had made a clerk ride through the snow over a $1 wagon, and every figure of it was false. Why Pelham had kept the record, Della could not know for certain. The letters suggested a man who had meant to use it, to hold it over Coyle, to buy himself out of his own debt with the threat of it. A gambler to the end, playing the one hand he had left. He had died before he could play it of a fever or a bottle or both, and his secret had gone under the floor with him and stayed there while the families he had helped to ruin scattered or starved or stayed on as hired hands on land that had been their own. Della sat with that knowledge in the cold for a long time. She was 19 years old, and she had been put out into the winter with $1. And in her hands she held the means to make herself comfortable for life, because a man like Coyle would pay a great deal to have these papers burned, and she knew it, and the knowing sat in her like a stone. This is the place where the story could have turned mean. A girl with nothing, a secret worth a fortune, a man who had wronged the helpless and would pay to keep it quiet. The easy thing, the expected thing, was to sell the silence. Tobias Reed, though, had taught her something besides the grain of oak. He had taught her that you build a thing true or you do not build it, and that a joint cut crooked to save an afternoon will fail under the first real weight, and bring down everything resting on it. She did not go to Coyle. She went to the families. It took her the rest of that winter, and it was the hardest work she had ever done, harder than any wheel. She had a wagon she could not move and a stack of papers she dared not leave, so she moved the papers and left the wagon, carrying the documents wrapped in their oilcloth inside her coat, walking the frozen valley road from claim to claim with Tobias's tool chest because she would not leave that either. She found them one by one, a widow named Esther Vane, who had lost the creek bottom and now cooked in another woman's kitchen the way Della's mother had. Della came to her on a gray afternoon and found her at a washtub in a stranger's yard, her hands red to the wrist. And when Della said her husband's name, the woman went still and did not turn around for a long moment. And then she dried her hands on her apron and said only that she had not heard that name spoken with respect in 3 years. A family called the Hartleys, 3 children and a father, whose hands shook, living in a soddy on the dry flat above the land that had been theirs. The father would not let her in at first. He stood in the low doorway with the children behind him and told her he had signed what he signed and there was an end of it, and that he wanted no trouble brought to his door in the cold, and Della did not argue with him. She set the deed on the upturned crate by the door, the deed with his name struck through, and she told him she would come back in a week, and she left it with him to read by his own fire. An old man named Day, who had signed because he could not read the figure, and had believed the kind voice that read it to him. He wept when she showed him the true ledger, not for the land, but for the years he had spent believing the fault was his own, and he gripped her wrist with a hand like a bundle of sticks, and asked her 3 times if she was certain, and 3 times she told him she was. She did not promise them anything. She showed them the papers. She showed Esther Vane the deed with her dead husband's name struck through, and the ledger page that showed the note had been called 4 months early, and she watched a woman who had decided years ago that the loss was her own fault learn that it had been a theft. She told each of them the same thing, plainly. The land was taken by a lie, and the proof of the lie was written down, and she meant to carry it to the territorial court in the spring, and if they would stand with her and swear to what they remembered, the false arithmetic could be undone. Some of them were afraid. Coyle still held paper on much of the valley, and a frightened family does not lightly cross the man who can call its note. She did not push them, though. She left each one with the truth and let it do its own work, the way she let a glued panel lift in its own time. There was a CTA aside in the middle of that winter, though Della would not have called it that. Word of what she was doing spread along the valley faster than she walked, and the people who had laughed at the auction stopped laughing, and a few of them grew quiet and ashamed, and one of them, the livery owner who had given her the loft, rode out to find her on the road and ask if it was true. If you have ever watched a person decide to do the harder right thing instead of the easy wrong one, you know the particular silence that fell over that valley. He did not offer money. He offered a team and a sledge to move the wagon to a safer place, and she took it because the wagon was evidence now, and evidence left in the open at the edge of a creditor's town does not stay safe for long. They moved it on a night with no moon, and it was well they did because Coyle had not been idle. He had learned by then what the girl had found, or enough of it. The clerk had reported the question she asked about the paper, and a man like Coyle, lying awake over a sum that would not close, had done the arithmetic and arrived at the only answer that fit. Hallam had kept a record. The wagon was the strong box. The girl had the key. And so on a morning late in that winter, Coyle sent 2 men to the edge of the lot to take the wagon back by whatever quiet means a debt allows, and they found the place at the edge of the siding empty, the frozen ruts of a sledge running off into the valley, and a girl already 3 days gone with everything that mattered sewn into the lining of her coat. What Coyle did then is the only place this story enters his thoughts, and it enters them only once. He sat in his freight office with his ledgers around him, the true ones and the false ones, and for the first time in many years he was afraid, because he understood that the foundation he had built his fortune upon was made of paper, and that paper burns, but paper also keeps. And somewhere in the valley a girl was carrying the one copy he had never known existed. He could call every note in the county and it would not help him. He could not call a note against the truth. He did not send the men again. A wiser kind of cruelty would have, perhaps, but Coyle had grown soft in the way that men grow soft when they have won for a long time, and he made the error such men make. He waited. He told himself the court was 60 miles off and the spring was far, and a girl of 19 would lose her nerve, or her papers, or her way before the roads opened. He told himself the arithmetic would close on its own, as it always had. It did not close. The roads opened in April. Delamont traveled the 60 miles to the county seat in the borrowed sledge-turned wagon, with Esther Vane beside her, and old Day and the trembling Hartley father following behind, because in the end, 7 of the 11 families had chosen to stand, and 7 was enough. The journey took 4 days over roads still soft with the thaw, and they camped the nights along the way. And around the fire the 7 of them talked low about what they would say and what they feared. And Della told them again that they had only to tell the truth as they remembered it, that the papers would carry the weight, and they had only to confirm it. She did not make a speech to the court. She had no gift for speeches and no wish to learn one. She laid the papers before the territorial judge in the order Tobias would have laid out tools for a job, the true ledger beside the false, the early foreclosure dates beside the real ones, the deeds with their struck-through names beside the living men and women who had owned them. When the judge asked her how she had come by the documents, she told him plainly that she had bought the wagon they were hidden in for $1 at a public auction, and had found them beneath its floor. And she set Pruitt's receipt on the table beside the rest, the make and the date and the sum in the auctioneer's own hand, so that her claim to the wagon and to everything in it stood as plain as the theft it had uncovered. She let the papers speak, because physical things do not lie the way a man's voice can, and a date written in a ledger in a man's own hand is a witness that cannot be frightened or paid. The court did not rule that spring. Courts move slowly, and Coyle had a lawyer, and the lawyer had every delay the law allows. The thing was done, though, the moment the papers were entered into the record, because once a thing is written into the public account, it cannot be unwritten, and Coyle's foundation, which had stood because no one had ever set the true figure beside the false, could not stand once both were on the same page in front of a judge. His credit failed first, the way a wheel fails, slowly, and then all at once. The men who had borrowed from him stopped fearing him. The bank that had backed his paper called on him to account for the discrepancies the court had entered, and he could not, because there is no accounting for a lie once the truth is filed beside it. Coyle did not stand and fall in a single dramatic hour. He simply became, over that spring and summer, a smaller and smaller man, until one day his office was let to another tenant and no one in Collie Bend could quite say when he had gone. The land came back. Not all of it, and not quickly, and not without years of the court's slow grinding. The creek bottom returned, though, to the people whose names had been struck from the deeds, and Esther Vane planted her own ground again in the third spring after, and the Hartley children grew up on the flat their father had thought lost. Della took none of it. She had not done the work to make herself rich, and when the families tried to give her a share of the recovered land, she would not have it because a thing taken as payment for justice is no longer justice, and she had been raised by a man who built things true. What she took instead was the wagon. When the court was done with it, when the papers had been copied and entered, and the false bottom emptied at last of everything it had hidden, the wagon was hers, plainly and beyond any creditor's claim. And she had it hauled back to Collie Bend and set up in a yard she rented at the edge of town with the small fee the court allowed her as the finder of the record. She mended it through the next winter the way Tobias had taught her, replacing the rotted boughs and the split seat and the gray rags of canvas, dishing 2 new wheels by hand, and she left the false bottom exactly as Asa Pelham had built it, the fine tongue and groove floor, the crosswise plank, the leather hinge gone hard as horn. She did not hide anything in it. She left it empty and clean. She kept it, though, because it had taught her something she did not have words for, about the things men build to hide and the things they build to last, and about how a careful hand can tell the difference. Delamotte opened a wheelwright's shop in Collie Bend in the autumn of 1880, 1 year to the season after a girl of 19 had been put out into the cold with a folded dollar. She was the only woman wheelwright in the territory, and for a time the men brought their work to her sideways to test her, and then they brought it plainly, because a wheel she dished did not fold, and a joint she cut did not fail, and the work spoke for her as she had always let work speak. She married late and had a daughter and taught the girl the grain of oak the way Tobias had taught her. In the open, with patience, ruining good hickory until the hand learned the blade. She lived a long life and a plain one, and she was buried. When her time came in the valley, her evidence had given back within sight of the creek bottom where Esther Vane's grandchildren still farmed. The wagon outlasted her. It stood in the yard behind the shop for 40 years, and then behind her daughter's shop after, and the false bottom was never used to hide a single thing again, because the girl who owned it had learned that the strongest thing you can put under a floor is not a fortune but the truth, and that the truth, unlike a fortune, grows heavier the longer it is kept, and lighter the moment it is set down where the light can reach it. In the last years anyone tells of it, the wagon sat with its tongue and groove floor swept clean, and its leather hinge oiled soft again, and the spokeshave that Tobias Reed had worn, bright in 40 years of work, hung on a peg on the wall above it, worn brighter still by the hand of the girl he taught. A child of the family asked once why they kept an old freight wagon no one drove, was told only that a woman had bought it for $1, when the whole town called it a grave, and had found a town's worth of justice under its floor, and had decided to keep the box that held it long after the box was empty. Did the dead gambler mean for a stranger to finish the hand he could not play, or did he only mean to save himself? And the good came after the way good sometimes comes from a selfish thing left long enough in the dark. No one living can say. If a story of a thing the world threw away, holding the proof that set a valley right, is the kind of story you would carry into your own winter, though there are others like it, and they are waiting where this one ends. The spokeshave hung on its peg, the floor lay swept and empty and true, and the cold that had once come up through a dead man's planks into the boots of a girl with $1 never reached that wagon again.